Apologies for the short time delay, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm delighted to introduce, as you'll see from your schedule, a slightly reworked timeline. Delighted to introduce Professor Dany Nobus of Brunel, the renowned psychoanalyst and historian of psychoanalysis. And he is going to be speaking, if one could do so over the noise of the airplanes, he's going to be speaking on Francis Bacon's eyes.
Thank you very much, Sacha. I'd first of all like to apologize to all of you, to the organizers in particular, for being late. I will not explain the reasons for that. They're not terribly interesting, but I would nonetheless try to also express my gratitude to you for starting without me, because it vastly reduces the sense of guilt that I will have to live with for some time after. And obviously, thank you also for the invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. I hope that you will be able to see the slides. There isn't much text on them. It's primarily images. But if there is text, I will read it out to you, so that should facilitate your access. In a conversation with the French novelist Franck Maubert from the early 1980s, Francis Bacon pondered the possibility that his work might very well constitute a long, permanent analysis on himself. In considering this aspect of his art, Bacon went on to paraphrase the words of Arthur Rimbaud in a famous letter to the poet Paul Demeny from 15 May 1871, which was written when Rimbaud was a mere 16 years old. You see the original French text from the letter and the English translation on the screen. I will restrict myself to the English translation. This is what Rimbaud wrote to Demeny. Quote, "I say one must be a seer, making oneself a seer. The poet, capital P, makes himself a seer by a long, gigantic and rational derangement of all the senses, un dérèglement de tous les sens. All forms of love, suffering and madness, he searches himself," unquote. Now, when being reminded of Rimbaud, Bacon only recalled a few words from these famous sentences, notably those that captured the means, the instrument, or you can even say the technique and the condition for turning oneself into a seer. Speaking to Maubert in French, Bacon conceded, I quote, "Peut-être en fin de compte, je fais une longue analyse permanente sur moi-même." Il rit, he's laughing. "Ça m'évoque le dérèglement des sens dont parlait Arthur Rimbaud. Oui, c'est peut-être ça que je mets en pratique. Je travaille sur moi-même," unquote. You can see the English translation there on your screen. It's worth noting here that Bacon did not repeat the all-encompassing operation upon which Rimbaud insisted. In Bacon's paraphrase, Rimbaud's le dérèglement de tous les sens became just le dérèglement des sens. Yet he nonetheless felt the need to emphasize that the object of the process of deregulation should not be restricted to one or the other sensory quality, but should involve a multiplicity of derangements, or at least a form of derangement that is sufficiently powerful to serve more than a single purpose. Now, to the best of my knowledge, but some of you Bacon specialists may contradict me, to the best of my knowledge, this passage from Bacon's conversations with Maubert, including the reference to Rimbaud, has received little or no attention in the enormous body of literature on Bacon's life and work. Perhaps because the text of these exchanges was, for reasons I don't know, never translated into English, or perhaps because it was always considered to be frivolous in OTOs. However, what we're left with when reading this passage is a series of questions that are as thought-provoking as they are puzzling, especially when it comes to developing an understanding of the nature of Bacon's artistic activity. Assuming that Bacon was referring to psychoanalysis when he employed the term analysis, how does this experience of the deregulation of the senses relate to the act of painting? How do all the senses become deranged when analysis is taking place? Given that Rimbaud was primarily a poet and Bacon was a painter, how does this derangement of the senses, all the senses, play out in the different practices to which the artists had committed themselves? What does it mean to derange the senses in the visual arts? And how would this act, or the long permanent process that results from it, take place? Neither Rimbaud nor Bacon had a psychoanalyst at their disposal, although Bacon could have had, to facilitate or expedite the operation, which in turn, of course, also elicits the question then to what extent the artistic activity itself may come to bypass and occupy the role that is conventionally reserved for the psychoanalyst. If we return to Rimbaud's letter to Demeny of May 1871, the first thing to note is that the absolute overarching derangement of the senses, which I propose to restrict here to the human faculty of perception, because in French, sens also means meaning, or it can mean direction rather than sense. But the first thing to note is that the absolute overarching derangement of the senses does not by definition accord equal value to each of the 5 sense organs: the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, and the skin. In other words, just because Rimbaud advocated a derangement of all the senses doesn't imply that each of them is to be deranged in the same way or to the same degree. The overall aim of the operation, as described by Rimbaud, was to allow the poet to become a seer, un voyant. Now, at first sight, and I'm not using this word lightly here, this observation may prompt the conclusion that of all the senses to be deranged, the sense of vision needs to remain most intact. Yet it is effectively exactly the opposite. In Rimbaud's portrayal of the poet as a seer, the derangement of smell, hearing, taste, and touch doesn't matter nearly as much as the derangement of vision, which is expected to be exhaustive, comprehensive, and complete. The archetypal figure of the blind poet Rimbaud had in mind here is, of course, the first poet in Western cultural history who is fully deserving of this name, and which would have enabled Rimbaud to indeed mention him as the poet with a capital P. The poet whose blindness was effectively also inscribed in his name, Homeros. Being blind would have prevented Homer from passing down his poetry and writing, leaving the act of recording and transcribing the verses to others. But it would have also compelled him to pay more attention to the musicality, the rhythm, and the meter of his words. More importantly, though, it would have forced him to put all his faith in another human faculty, which draws upon the cognitive function that makes the poet turn inwards, and which simultaneously introduces the dimension of time. Homer's blindness redirects him to Mnemosyne, the Greek goddess of memory. But there is more to Rimbaud's words than the implicit invocation of Homer as the first blind poet. In fact, Homer is not acknowledged in Greek mythology as a prophet, of course, a seer, or a soothsayer at all. When it comes to acts of premonition, this role is generally accorded to other figures, the most famous of whom undoubtedly being Tiresias. The blind prophet who also makes an appearance in the Odyssey, but whose claim to fame is primarily based upon his dramatic interventions in Sophocles' Oedipus Rex and Antigone. In both plays, it is Tiresias who steers the narrative towards its tragic climax by unveiling the truth to those who've thus far been blind, in a metaphorical sense of failing to acknowledge the true nature of the affairs in which they've been embroiled. In Oedipus Rex, Tiresias' revelation of the truth is perhaps the most poignant, because although it allows Oedipus to see, and for the very first time, how he himself has unwittingly thrown Thebes into ruin, he famously reacts to the disclosure of the truth with an act of self-blinding. Indeed, when Oedipus acquires the capacity to see, he remains totally blind. It is only when he finally starts to see that blindness becomes his fate. Now, if the derangement of all the senses that Rimbaud presented to Demeny as a precondition for the emergence of the poet as a seer clearly accords preeminent status to the field of vision, then Bacon's recollection of Rimbaud's principle makes this field of vision even more prominent than any of the other senses, purely by virtue of the artistic practice to which the principle is applied. In poetry, the poet, blind as he or she may be, makes the words appeal to a multiplicity of senses, vision and hearing, sight and sound, but by no means to the detriment of all the others, especially if the poet, like Rimbaud but also like Baudelaire, aims at creating a unique experience of synesthesia, spoken words suddenly acquiring a sense of vision, taste, smell, or even touch. Painting, however, is the quintessential visual art. It may even be the original, the first visual art. And it may not entirely exclude the other senses apart from vision, especially for the painter who is going through the act of painting, but the painting itself, of course, fixates its audience in the strict position of viewers, spectators, of what is being presented to them on the canvas that offers itself to the eye. Unlike the poem, the painting isn't meant to be heard. The painting isn't meant to be touched or smelled or tasted. It doesn't by definition mean that the painting can't speak and that it exists entirely outside the structure of language, but even the symbolic element of speech is always mediated by the field of vision. When Bacon invoked Rimbaud's derangement of the senses as the primary factor behind the process of analysis that he may have been conducting on himself through his act of painting, it's therefore legitimate to say, I think, that the derangement in question would have been almost entirely restricted to the field of vision. And indeed, if blindness is to be conceived as the destruction, the impairment, the distortion, or the disappearance of vision, as the full direct optical access to an external object, it's quite extraordinary to see that of all the 20th century figurative painters, Bacon is the painter of blindness par excellence. Blindness is not to be interpreted here, as Merleau-Ponty does at some point in The Visible and the Invisible, as the powerless of the eye, but rather as the destruction, the impairment, the distortion, or the disappearance of vision as a direct optical access to an external object, as I said earlier on. Indeed, looking through the phenomenal body of work that has now been collected and annotated thanks to Martin Harrison in Bacon's Catalogue Raisonné, there are but 6 paintings, 6, in the colossal amount of pictures, drawings and sketches that have survived Bacon's own forever eager hands of destruction. There are but 6 paintings in which the sensory system of vision of the figures of the canvas remains fully intact. There are but 6 pictures in which the sense of vision is not in one way or another deranged, and where the work of analysis that he was carrying out on himself seems to have stuttered, stagnated, or even failed, assuming that the derangement of vision is a precondition, of course, for the analysis to take place. The first portrait from the late 1920s or early 1930s, in which Bacon was experimenting with various techniques and that most spectators are unlikely to even recognize. I don't know what you would think when you saw this painting just now, but maybe some of you wouldn't even recognize it as a signature Bacon. Because it's an early attempt at capturing the reality. The second is the 1951 portrait of Lucian Freud, which is widely considered to be Bacon's first portrait of a named sitter, a named model, and which is therefore the primary result of, quote, the process of painting from a live model that Bacon always found awkward and embarrassing, unquote. This is from an interview with David Sylvester, by the way. In this case, the painting displays the prototypical Baconian frame. Yet again, it probably doesn't stand out as a classic Bacon, let alone a Baconian masterpiece. The third was in all likelihood painted shortly after the Freud portrait and was Bacon's first attempt at capturing the reality of Pope Innocent X after Velázquez. The fourth is a 1953 variation on the series of popes that Bacon painted in quick succession during that year, and which was reportedly begun as a portrait of David Sylvester, a portrait of David Sylvester that gradually acquired the image of the Pope. The fifth is a painting of a Pope, which is part of a series of 6 that Bacon produced in 1961, and which he effectively conceived as a double triptych, or I might even say a single exiptych, although it was never displayed as such. And finally, the sixth painting, in which the sense of vision is not somehow deranged, is perhaps the most interesting one, because it concerns a picture within a picture, which is itself part of a triptych of 3 different named figures. This work is called 3 Portraits, Posthumous Portrait of George Dyer, Self-Portrait, Portrait of Lucian Freud. Painted in 1973, as you can see. And it is remarkable not only because Bacon moved away here from his common practice of employing the triptych as a formal tool for creating 3 versions on the same theme, but also because on the left and the right panels, the figures of George Dyer and Lucian Freud respectively are duplicated, whilst the 3 mirrors reflect nothing at all. What stands out, though, perhaps more than anything else, are the undistorted eyes. I won't be able to use this, I think, on the screen. What I'm referring to is this. What stands out, though, are the undistorted eyes of George Dyer in the portrait that is pinned to the wall of his panel. Eyes that may be seen as sad, exhausted, or imploring, but that preserve the capacity, we are led to believe, of seeing, notably at a moment when the body in which they would have been located had already died, some 18 months earlier, because this triptych was painted roughly 18 months after George Dyer died in Paris. Let me be honest. Maybe my tally of painted figures in Bacon's work whose sense of vision has remained fully intact is an underestimate, because I consciously or unconsciously overlooked some instances of an apparently functional sense of vision. That is to say, because my own sense of vision was somehow also already deranged, or because I started off with a definition of blindness that is too broad and then applied it too rigidly. It may very well be the case, but I don't think that closer scrutiny of Bacon's catalogue raisonné and a narrower concept of blindness would actually generate a radically different perspective on Bacon's own interpretation and implementation of Rimbaud's famous derangement of the senses. Regardless as to the criteria one may use to approach the representational quality of certain figures or series of figures, Bacon, I would argue, is the ultimate champion of figurative derangement of the sense of vision. And indeed, it is because he works in the visual arts that it is primarily this optical sense that is being singled out for distortion. Looking again through the huge amount of work Bacon left behind, no less than 10, sorry, this was my, I should have done this earlier, obviously, my own Baconian touch. Looking again through the huge amount of work Bacon left behind, no less than 10 modalities of visual derangement can be identified. Maybe more. I managed to identify 10. 10 modalities which, in the interest of time, I shall just summarily name and illustrate. Each modality, of course, would deserve its own separate elaboration. In each case, however, it concerns an operation on the sense of vision of the representational figures by means of a specific act of painting that in itself, as you will see in a minute,
may take various forms, insofar as it can sometimes be achieved through a simple brushstroke, and you'll see, or a small intervention on the technical equipment that enables seeing to happen, but at other times it can also be accomplished with equal effectiveness by the absence of paint. The sense of vision disappearing as a result of the figure's gradual absorption into the blank canvas. In no particular order, you can see them on the screen, in no particular order because I don't think there's a hierarchy here, the 10 modalities of blindness in Bacon's work can be designated, at least I designated them, as omission, obfuscation, closing, cutting, deformation, squinting, looking awry, fading, erasure, and breaking. These are by no means the only techniques to which Bacon could have had recourse in order to capture the derangement of vision, yet I have found no evidence of other modalities. Other modalities such as enucleation, slicing, you will remember the famous opening scene of Un Chien Andalou, or indeed painting figures with dark glasses, right? Which is a classic representation of blindness, or at least the belief that the person behind the dark glasses could very well be blind. Of the 10 modalities of blindness, you are no doubt most familiar with the practice of omission, if only because omission is a key feature of the 1944 triptych with which Bacon sealed his name and fame as the greatest figurative painter of the 20th century. The 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion. Whatever the nature of the biomorph of the life form that Bacon represented in this triptych, one of the most striking characteristics of these 3 figures is that their eyes are missing, which crucially contributes to the semantic ambiguity of the distended mouth in the central and the right panel. And if the figure in the central panel belongs to the same species as its 2 companions, I don't know, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but it looks like it, one would feel hard-pressed to see the piece of cloth that is wrapped around its head as a blindfold, for the simple reason that there probably is no visual sense here in the first place, and that the cloth serves perhaps more appositely as a headscarf, a hairband, or even a serviette. The second technique of obfuscation is easily recognizable in the eponymous painting 1946, which created quite a stir when it was first exhibited at the Redfern Gallery here in London, but which Bacon considered to be a defining moment in his career. Here, the spectator is quite literally left in the dark about the central figure's eyes, because the top half of the head is concealed by the pitch black internal space of the umbrella above its head. The cadmium orange droplets on the figure's upper lip may suggest that, much like the chunks of flesh surrounding and containing it, this proto-human life form has also been exposed to an act of butchery during which the eyes were removed, yet the shadow that is cast by the umbrella, and which contrasts sharply with the strikingly white exposure of the chin, the collar, and the teeth, makes every inference purely speculative. The technique of closing runs through Bacon's entire pictorial output and is not restricted to one type of figure or one specific format. It occurs in the self-portraits as much as it is being used in the portraits of others, and it may feature in standalone paintings as much as it can be part of one or more panels of a triptych. In this case, the figure's eyes are represented, the sense of sight is removed because the eyelids are closed. 2 examples are projected there. 2 examples of the study for portrait 3 after the life mask of William Blake, 1955, and the central panel of the 1983 triptych 3 studies for self-portrait. Unlike closing, cutting involves the partial removal of one or more parts of a figure's sense of vision, either through the application of a simple brushstroke or through the mere absence of paint, which means that the figure remains partially blind because half of their eyes become absorbed by the unprimed canvas, which you see there in the seated figure of 1978 to the right of the screen. Cutting differs from omission because in the technique of cutting, the viewer knows that the figure is endowed, probably with a sense of vision, since enough of the sensory organ is left intact. Cutting may coincide with the closure of the other parts of the sensory organs, but it may also allow the uncut part of the eyes to remain open. The fifth technique of deformation may take various forms and is also not restricted to one or the other figure or format. It differs from cutting because here the viewer can still identify more or less the presence of two eyes, or a supposedly complete sensory organ of vision. Yet one or both parts of the optical system are misshapen, contorted, disfigured, to use a word that the previous speaker insisted upon. Much like the previous techniques, deformation can be part of one panel in a triptych or feature in a standalone picture. I'll give you two examples here. The central panel of the three studies for Portrait of Henrietta Marias, 1963, and the Portrait of Lucian Freud, 1965. By contrast with deformation, squinting is a more subtle technique, which either represents the eyes of the figure as pointing in different directions, or, as is more common in Bacon's later work, which captures the eyes as narrowed or partly closed, suggesting that the figures have difficulty seeing what they're supposed to expose to, or are exposed to an unusually intense, blinding source of light, which involuntarily makes them adjust their eyes. The seventh technique of looking awry represents the figures on the canvas as looking in an unexpected, strange, or quote-unquote wrong direction. And it is especially prominent in Bacon's self-portraits of the late 1970s and early 1980s. Yet it can also be detected in other paintings, such as the portrait of a man walking down the steps to the right of your screen there from 1972. In the self-portraits, the figures generally avert their eyes, looking downwards or sideways, thus making them blind to the eye of the painter that attempts to bring their optical reality to life on the canvas. In the portrait of a man walking down the steps to the right, which is considered to be a portrait of George Dyer, painted shortly after his death, the vulnerability of the character is overdetermined and multifaceted, of course. With one hand holding onto the window frame and the other hand seemingly attached to the strangely curved banister, the figure's feet are positioned awkwardly, very awkwardly and incongruously indeed, as if the figure here has already lost his balance and is desperately trying to cushion the impact of the fall. Yet perhaps the most striking feature of the painting is indeed that the character's eyes are not fixated on any material aspect of the situation in which he is finding himself in, but peering, assuming that he can see, in the distance, towards someone or something that lies outside the canvas. The figure is blind to the circumstances of his fall and blind to whatever it is that may help him maintain his balance precisely because his optical sense is fundamentally directed elsewhere. Fading and erasure, the eighth and the ninth modalities, are similar insofar as they both involve pictorial representations of the derangement of vision that are the result of a process of what we call decomposition. In the literal sense of the word, as the sense of vision being barred from the actual composition of the painting. Yet fading differs from erasure because fading involves a technique that allows the sensory organs to merge with the background, whereas erasure always involves the presence and power of additional clearly identifiable brushstrokes, which often stand out through their color scheme or the repetition of the strokes. I'll show you in a minute. The typical examples of fading are the painting Head from 1948 and Head 6 from 1949, which remains one of Bacon's best loved and most disturbing pictures, I think. Erasure tends to make a later appearance in Bacon's work, even though it is not completely absent from the earlier works. Much like many of the other techniques, it's not restricted to a singular figure, nor to a certain form or framing. Here is the study portrait of Isabel Rousseau, 1962, with another famous example is this one, the 3 studies for a portrait, Mick Jagger, 1982. I hope you can see the brushstrokes with which the sense of vision is actually treated. Finally, the 10th modality of blindness, which I've decided to call breaking, is probably as familiar as the one with which I started my list. It's probably as familiar as the omission, partly because it features prominently in Bacon's most famous Pope portrait, partly because its source and origin, the silent scream of the nanny, the silent scream of the nanny in the Odessa step sequence in Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin, has settled itself in our collective memory as one of the most dramatic figurations of anguish and despair. It's important to note here that the representational figuration of breaking does not strictly apply to the sensory organ of vision as such, but rather to the artificial eyes that allow vision to be maintained. Another less well-known example of the technique features in Bacon's Portrait of a Man with Glasses, 1963. Here, Bacon doesn't so much break the physiological organ of the eye, but only its prosthetic extension, the specially constructed lenses that we refer to as spectacles or glasses. But the effect is exactly the same. In having their spectacles taken away, broken, damaged, or destroyed, the figures lose their ability to see. At this point, and for the remainder, I need about 5-6 minutes or so. Yeah. At this point, and for the remainder of the time I've got left, it's probably tempting to examine how this recurrent, seemingly obsessive representation of blindness in Bacon's work should be interpreted. Where does it stem from? How can it be explained? What does it mean, over and above Bacon's own oblique reference to Rimbaud's derangement of the senses as the precondition for conducting a process of analysis on oneself, via the act, in this case, of artistic creation? The conventional psychoanalytic answer would probably be that Francis Bacon, owing to some unresolved infantile sexual repressed conflict, that Francis Bacon must have suffered from some kind of Augenangst, Freud would have called it. It's a term he uses in the essay on the uncanny, and which is ambiguous in its own right, because Augenangst can mean the anxiety that is induced by someone's eyes, but it can also mean the anxiety that you actually see in the eyes of the person in front of you. Right? It's a hypothesis that could be entertained, but which could only be substantiated on the basis of what is commonly called a psychobiographical investigation, for which, my friends, I unfortunately have no sympathy whatsoever. A slightly more sophisticated, yet equally conventional psychoanalytic reading could be that Bacon's lifelong painting cure, in which he not only tried to tame his own demons, but also attempted to dislodge the symbolic elements that organized his mental space, required the facilitating agency, which in this case would have been the picture itself, to operate outside the painter's own field of vision. In rendering his figures blind or disturbing their vision, the painter would thus both enhance their capacity to listen to his own pictorial experiments, to his studies, to his repetitions, and initiate a fundamental cut in the field of vision, much like the analyst is traditionally, conventionally, positioned behind the couch, outside the patient's visual range. Now, interesting as these observations may be, they unfortunately, I think, reduce the question of Francis Bacon's eyes to a semantic issue, right? To the question of what does it mean? It reduces the question to the search for a plausible storyline, which could not be further removed from what Bacon himself intended to achieve, as he himself conceded in his first interview with David Sylvester. My memory serves me right. In the first interview, Bacon argues that if there's anything that he detests, it's the search for a narrative, for a storyline. If blindness is to be taken as a central puzzling characteristic of Bacon's work, it's thus perhaps not the meaning of it that matters, but rather the place it occupies in his artistic labor. To elaborate this point would require an in-depth study of four things, which again I will only list because time prevents me from elaborating on each of those. It would require an in-depth study of the relation between seeing blindness and the gaze. It would require an in-depth study of the status of the painting as what is being seen by the painter without it looking back from the point, the organs of vision, that is conventionally identified as a source of seeing. It would require an investigation of the relation between the act of painting, the visible presence of the model's physical reality, and the invisibility of what the painter is trying to capture on the canvas. It would require an examination of the relation, finally, between the visual act of the painter, the blindness of the figures on the canvas, and the eye of the spectator. All of us who here and now are looking at these images, trying to identify what they represent. As far as the relation between seeing blindness and the gaze is concerned, it's difficult, I think, to avoid the conclusion that in rendering his figures blind, Bacon merely wanted to stay in control of his work. The painter, as the initiator and the agency of the act, looks at the painting as the outcome and the object of the artistic process. But the painting is somehow prevented from looking back through the sense of vision, through the eyes. Even the self-portrait is not allowed to reflect the painter's eye unless, and perhaps this is the only exception in Bacon's immense series of self-portraits, unless the painter's eye is already partially closed. I'm referring here to the 1972 self-portrait with an injured eye, which was painted shortly after the death of George Dyer and which captured the painter with a swollen, deformed eye after a drunken brawl in London's West End. A classic case of life imitating art. In relying on Lacan's 4 lectures on the split between the eye and the gaze from February and March 1964, with which some of you might be familiar in the Seminar on the 4 Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis, you might effectively argue that in rendering his figures blind, the painter abdicates rather than consolidates control. Because in depriving his figures from the physiological sense of vision and inducing a form of blindness at the level of the eyes, the location of the seeing eye is replaced with the ubiquity of the gaze, which transforms the subject-object relation and turns the painter into the recipient, into the receiver of a source of power that is always already situated elsewhere, somewhere in the space of the canvas, but outside his hands. Perhaps this is why the 1953 painting of David Sylvester gradually turned itself into a pope, with the caveat that His Highness was eventually allowed to see, but maybe only for David Sylvester to speak through his avatar's eyes with an unequivocal reprimand or a harrowing question. Look what you've done to me, Francis Bacon. How on earth could you have allowed me to turn myself, could you allow me to become a pope? So the statement that I'd like to adduce here with reference to the first issue is that the imposition of blindness makes space for the emergence of the gaze. The gaze is an object of desire, an object to which the painter can only respond with the rhetorical question, what do you want? Which is in this case as much addressed to the canvas as it is to himself. These succinct remarks immediately conjure up the question concerning the status of the painting. Again, not in the sense of what it means or what it represents, but in the sense of what the place it is that it occupies in the painter's own world of perception. Lacan devoted an entire lecture to this question on 11 March 1964. Yet here I merely wish to repeat a highly evocative phrase by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Sorry, this is David Sylvester turned into a pope, right? But that's one of the exceptions. A highly evocative phrase by Maurice Merleau-Ponty from the last text that he saw published during his lifetime, called L'œil et l'esprit, published in January 1960, I think. And a text with which Lacan, of course, would have been more than familiar. I quote, "Ultimately, the painting relates to nothing at all among experienced things, unless it is first of all auto-figurative. It's a spectacle of something only by being a spectacle of nothing, by breaking the skin of things to show how the things become things, how the world becomes world," unquote. What Merleau-Ponty has in mind here is that a painting is less created than it is endowed with the power to shape itself. But, I can add, also with the power to shape and reshape its alleged creator, that is to say, in this case, Francis Bacon. Of the four issues, and I'm really coming to my conclusion now, the four issues that I identified earlier, the third would deserve the most extensive elaboration, because it probes deeper than any of the others into the nature of Bacon's artistic practice. Now, at this point, I would simply like to remind you that by contrast with most of his contemporary figurative painters, such as Lucian Freud, Bacon did not paint from sitters or live models, apart from on 2 or 3 occasions. In fact, anyone who has seen the arrangement of Francis Bacon's studio, whether in the reconstruction of Dublin's Hugh Lane Gallery, on the photographs of Perry Ogden, if you look at Francis Bacon's studio, you rapidly arrive at the conclusion that the chaos and disorder would have made the presence of a sitter next to impossible. Right? I mean, how can you be a sitter or a model in this kind of space, you see? But the upshot of Bacon's persistent refusal to paint from live models is that the blindness of the figures in his paintings does to some extent reflect the derangement of the painter's own sense of vision whilst he's painting them. Francis Bacon's eyes are therefore almost always turned inwards, looking for images of realities that have been recorded in his memory, searching for memory traces of the figures that captured his imagination, or trying to capture the impact on his own mind of what the eyes of other painters and often photographers such as Muybridge had registered in the world. To develop this point, it would seem imperative to me to return to Derrida's reflections on vision and self-representation in his 1990, or the English translation from 1993, volume Memoirs of the Blind, in which Derrida paid detailed attention to Charles Baudelaire's 1863 essay, The Painter of Modern Life, Le Peintre de la Vie Moderne. And this is where I will conclude. The fifth section of this essay by Baudelaire, which is no more than 5 short paragraphs in length, is entitled The Art of Memory, Mnemonic Art, in the English translation, obviously. I shall leave you by way of conclusion with a small extract from Baudelaire's text. It's projected on the screen. Quote, "All good and true artists draw from the image imprinted on their brains and not from nature. If one presents us with the admirable sketches of Raphael, Watteau, and many another, as counterexamples, we could reply that these are notes, very detailed notes, it is true, but simply notes. When the true artist embarks on the definitive execution of a work, its model would be more an embarrassment than an aid. Thus, a duel is initiated between the desire to grasp every detail, to forget nothing, and the faculty of memory, which has formed the habit of absorbing in a lively manner the general color and outline, the arabesque of contours. Artists possessing a perfect feeling for form, but accustomed to exercising their memory and imagination above all, will find themselves assailed by a riot of details, all clamoring for justice with the fury of a crowd enamored of absolute equality. Justice is everywhere trampled underfoot. All harmony is destroyed, sacrificed. Many a triviality becomes an enormity, many a trifle a usurper. The more the artist thinks to treat the details with impartiality, the greater the anarchy, whether myopic or long-sighted, all sense of hierarchy or subordination vanishes, unquote. I would have been very curious to see what Baudelaire, if anything, would have changed to these lines if he had had the opportunity to write them, to compose them after Francis Bacon had started painting his work. Look, I don't know whether Francis Bacon ever read these lines. I did look at the library catalogue that is preserved of his books at the Hugh Lane gallery, but for all I could tell, there is no copy of Baudelaire's work. But we know that some books have disappeared. Bacon owned a copy of Lacan's Écrit, by the way, which no one has ever found. It's disappeared. So I don't know whether Bacon ever read these lines. But if he did, I can't resist the feeling that after having read them, perhaps he may have just closed his eyes. He may have just closed his eyes in order to start a new painting. Thank you.
Fantastic. So thank you very much to Dany. That was really fascinating stuff. So we have a little over 15 minutes for questions. My colleague has a microphone. If you could wait, please, for that to come around just so everyone could hear you. Who would like to kick us off? I should say, by the way, coffee has arrived, so we'll get coffee in 15 minutes. So don't need to take much longer. Yeah, there you go. It's an incentive. Ben, do you want to kick us off, please?
Thanks for that, Dany. That was really, really excellent. It just had me thinking a little bit about the history of the blind eye, the mutilated eye, and the transfigured eye that emerges kind of in modernist and especially surrealist artistic production. I think you already mentioned the scene in Ancien Andalou. One might also recall Max Ernst's painting, The Two Ambiguous Figures, and indeed Bataille's early novel, The Story of the Eye. There seems to be something a little bit kind of strange about this tradition, that on the one hand, there is this, I guess, a kind of move against ocular centrism, a dethroning of vision, in some sense, and a subversion of the classical relation between seeing and truth. But at the same time, vision still seems to hold a kind of primary position. Indeed, the denigration of the visual is precisely what demands to be seen. So my question is, I guess, to the extent that there is one, is do you think Bacon is adding anything new to that tradition in any way?
Yes.
We'll leave it there.
I mean, it's a fantastic question, and I kind of like the idea of the oculocentrism and seeing as the conduit to access reality. I'm not sure where to start, but I'll do my best. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, Bacon himself didn't explicitly inscribe his own work in a tradition of painting. Correct me if I'm wrong, or if he did, it was to distance himself from it. But you're absolutely right, of course, that what you call the dethroning of the eye, or the attack on oculocentrism has a history, and probably not just in the visual arts, but in the visual arts, it has a history that transcends painting, because your example, which I also gave, of Un chien andalou is an example from cinema. Now, my response would be that if Bacon adds something to it, if he does, I would say it's for a different purpose. The purpose here being that, and I did manage to follow about half of your lecture. The purpose here being that he's trying to move away from the idea that access to reality, or the conception of reality as a natural objective given, can take place through the sense of vision. And of course, the fact that he does it via a painting makes it all the more interesting, because the painting, much like cinema, but of course, but the painting here as a medium that he uses is in itself a paradoxical form of access to this reality. So I would say what he adds is a different purpose, and I won't go into depth as to what the surrealists had to say about vision and the senses, but I think for him it's all to do with moving away from seeing, and maybe you just said that, and I'm just repeating you, from seeing as what is generally associated with the sense that gives you access to the naked reality, or the true reality, or the material reality. Which to me would also explain why Bacon was so fascinated by this one or two sentences in one of Van Gogh's letters to his brother, in which Van Gogh says, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't have them in front of me, Van Gogh says, painting reality has little or nothing to do with the painter trying to reproduce what he sees. It has everything to do with the painter expressing his own internal feelings about his experience. Now, other impressionists would probably have said the same, but for Bacon, this was the crucial sentence that didn't just explain Van Gogh's work, and obviously Van Gogh was not a surrealist, but that he also, wanted to latch onto as a fundamental conceptual, but also technical basis for his own artistic practice. I mean, that's the best I can do for now. But I think your question opens up onto a wide range of other questions about where the Bacon's eyes, his blindness, need to be situated in the history of figurative painting, and to what extent his approach differs from or relates to these other traditions. But thank you very much, and I really like the idea of the oculocentrism, by the way. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. In the middle, please. Hello.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you could just clarify what the purpose of the derangement of the senses is for Rimbaud, because with Bacon it sounds like the purpose is to turn inwards.
Sure.
And to sort of draw from the inner life. But with Rimbaud you mentioned being a voyeur, and to me that sounds a bit more like it's concerned with the outside. So I'm just wondering, is that the difference, or?
I mean, Rimbaud, too inscribes himself in a tradition of poetry. The late 19th century French symbolists, of which Charles Baudelaire was also an exponent, tried to achieve synesthesia, basically. The derangement of the senses. By the way, in French, it's le dérèglement. But you can't translate it as deregulation because it's a false cognate, right? So you have to translate it as derangement. But what they try to achieve, I would say, is synesthesia. So the overlap or a move away from the senses as separate, distinct tools for accessing external and internal reality. Now, Rimbaud didn't invent that, nor did Baudelaire. You find it in Dante occasionally. Well, I think Virgil says to the protagonist, please try to feel my words, right? Or please try to taste the colors of what I'm trying to express to you. So for them, that's what they're trying to achieve. But you're absolutely right that Bacon, although he adopts the principle, for Bacon, I think it's consciously or unconsciously geared towards something else. As a result of which, what you get, and that's what I've been trying to argue, and what I hopefully came across, what you get is, as you put it, an act of painting that relies more heavily on memory rather than on the reproduction and the interpretation of what your eyes allow you to see by way of the model or the photograph, etc., etc. So what we have here in Bacon's artistic practice is a connection, but at the same time also an interrelation that he's trying to establish between reality, memory, and the imagination. There you go. Reality, memory, and the imagination. And for that, the arrangement of the senses, for him at least, is an absolute precondition.
Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you, Dany. I just have a psychoanalytic comment to make. When I was listening to your paper, you mentioned Tiresias. And you probably know, I didn't know why Tiresias was blinded. And I learned why from Lacan in his Seminal 10 on anxiety. So Tiresias is blinded because he knows that women enjoy more in sex than men. Apparently Zeus and Hera visit him to find out, and he knows because he has himself been a woman for 7 years, and then he went back to being a man. So as I was reading and listening to your paper today, and thinking about Bacon and his fascination or interest, according to what you presented with blindness, I was thinking in a kind of psychoanalytic way whether actually this is a route to his own questions around sexuality and female jouissance. I don't know if you've thought about that or have any comment.
I mean, first of all, as you were speaking, thanks for the question, Maria. I mean, as you were speaking, I was trying to remember the Greek myth. But the problem with the Greek myths, as you know, is that there are different versions of it, right? So there's never just one version of the Greek myth. But I think in one version at least, it's not so much that Tiresias was blinded because he's acquired knowledge of how women enjoy sexually. In one version, he's blinded because he comes across two coiling snakes and he disturbs them or something like that. But anyway, I mean, let's leave that to aside, because I think the point of your question goes much further, and it's a question about sexuality, in fact, right, and enjoyment, jouissance. Lacan would have had it. And I mean, to be honest, I haven't thought about it. I really haven't. maybe I repressed it, right? But I mean, isn't it true that in every creative act, whether it's painting or cinema or music, isn't it true that in every creative act, and I think Freud would agree with me as well, that you draw on libidinal forces, and that inevitably sexuality enters the equation. Now, again, as I said, I don't have much sympathy for psychobiography, and I would be the last person in the world to try and map Bacon's own sexuality onto the blindness of the figures, but yeah, I mean, it shouldn't stop you from reading some of these figures, especially the studies for figures that are based for crucifixion, as having their mouth wide open because they're in a state of ecstasy, right? But there's lots of different interpretations of that, of course. I was rather trying to make the point that by removing the eyes, the gaze manifests itself, and it's much more disturbing. So the eyes, which only represented fully in 6 pictures, they introduce a sense of comfort almost. It's pacifying. By removing them, it becomes not only disruptive but disturbing. I think Alenka had a question.
We've got, there was one more at the back first. Do you want? Yeah, let's do that first row down there.
Thank you. Really interesting observations. I just wanted to relate it to a point that Darren made in his talk and get your view on that. Specifically in relation to, I guess, a distinction between the self and the body. I suppose the self is a unity, which Darren related to, I guess, a Nietzschean moment in thought. I guess in terms of everything that's implied in the phrase "God is dead," and what's made that particularly interesting to me is the relation of all this to Velázquez's portrait, which off the top of my head I can't think of a stronger gaze in the whole of art, to be honest, than that, and which is also a painting that Bacon described as the greatest portrait in all of art. So I suppose the question I'm interested in is, does Bacon have a problem fundamentally with the eye in terms of trying to access something other than the self, a unified self that you might think as the result of a now expired belief system? Is there something fundamentally challenging in the eye for him in terms of trying to access the pulsations, the body, this other aspect of the self that he's, of the human that he's interested in?
Thank you for your question. I will probably disappoint you. I'm not sure. I mean, again, I've given a lot of thought, both in this paper and in a paper that was published in one of the books that lies at the back. I've given a lot of thought to Bacon's artistic practice, not only in terms of what he was trying to achieve, but in terms of what he was effectively doing. You know, the labor of painting, including his relation to the paint. But what you're saying now makes me think that, well, see, maybe what you see here represented is a reflection of Bacon's constant encounter of vision as an obstacle more than anything else, a bodily physiological obstacle when it comes to trying to capture the reality on the canvas. I mean, you could have painted blind, but to the best of my knowledge, never did. But in a sense, he did paint blind, given that he didn't paint from a model or a sitter, but from memory. But yeah, my response would be, blindness is a conduit to capturing reality because the eyes are an obstacle. And the eyes are an obstacle because the act of seeing, like Ben said earlier on, the act of seeing is deceiving in terms of recording and registering the reality of the figure that you want to capture. That's the only thing I can say, really.
Okay. We have, sorry, I know there are people in the queue, so my apologies for that. We have time for one more. Alenka.
Yeah, thank you very much for this paper. I really enjoyed it. Actually, I have one perhaps more like a comment and one question that you perhaps already answered now with the last answer. The comment is just that it is interesting, the example, the first of the examples of erasure that you showed us, if you can find it.
Yeah, sure. No problem, Alenka.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting that here there are actually three senses that are being erased: the ear, the mouth, and the eye. So yes, it's a kind of multiplied, like the figuration of whatever the reglementation. So, but this is just, it struck me as something that goes further than just the eye, and that relates to other senses, precisely, at least the organs that we associate with the senses.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
But then actually my question was, because I was kind of, I think you answered it now, but I was kind of puzzled with this idea. You say he captures the reality by precisely painting the way he sees it, not simply what is out there, but the way he sees it. And how, but I think here it is very important first to really distinguish, because he kept seriously distinguishing himself from expressionist.
Sure.
And from this idea of kind of just express what you feel, particularly. So already there is this certain distinction between feeling and seeing. Is it what you see, what you feel? I don't know. There is an interesting duality there. But actually my question was simply this. By painting, as you said, from memory or from whatever thing registers in your imagination or in your reasoning about what you see, by painting this instead of pretending to whatever directly copy what is out there, does this remove you further from the reality, or the opposite? Does it bring you actually as precisely this addition of the excess of subjectivity? Does it actually bring you closer to the real and closer to what is out there? Not simply the movement of kind of turning your gaze or whatever inside and then showing us what you see there, but actually if there is this move of extimacy, so to say, precisely, which is not where precisely the exterior can only be approached by this movement that seems to simply be directed inwards, but that in a way finds a way to capture something there, which is something that just some kind of like neutral picture would not have.
I mean, look, Alenka, thank you for the question, and indeed for the observation, which I could have mentioned, but didn't. But you're absolutely right, of course, that the erasure is much more extensive than just covering or affecting the eyes. I mean, look, if Francis Bacon had been sitting here, I think he would have agreed with your second option rather than the first, and say, no, it's my attempt at bringing myself closer to capturing the reality of the figures that are represented, and as such, again, I'm relying on my own memory now. I think in one of the conversations with Maubert, he mentions that because of this, every portrait, whether it's a self-portrait or a portrait of Isabel Rawsthorne or indeed Mick Jagger, every portrait is in a sense a self-portrait. It's a self-portrait because the portrait is a portrait of someone else mediated by the painter's own attempt at getting close or merging with the reality of the imaginary mnemonic model. But I think at the same time that although the second option will apply here, Bacon also constantly has to somehow accept that whether it's the scream or something else that he's trying to capture, it always to some extent fails. Is it to Sylvester that he says that his only ambition was ever was to paint the greatest scream in the history of painting, or something like that, right? Right. Okay. Right. Okay. Right. So there's also in Bacon's practice a recurrent, I would say, a recurrent experience of failure or lack. So you can try to bypass the obstacle, but the obstacle is always, to some extent, still there, as a result of which he needs to carry on. He needs to move on. So I would actually argue that the repetition that you occasionally see in the triptychs, but also in the almost endless portraits of himself and specific figures is an ongoing attempt at capturing the reality, but at the same time an ongoing acknowledgement that that attempt to some extent fails. And what you then see at the very end of Bacon's work is an attempt at minimalism. So if you look at the very last paintings, although of course we and he wouldn't have known that they were going to be the last of the final paintings, but the paint itself tends to occupy a less prominent space on the canvas. So the last paintings are paintings whereby the unprimed canvas itself starts to occupy a prominent place in the actual frame. And I think it's this move to minimalism or this engagement with emptiness that is yet another attempt, in this case the final attempt, because he died, of course, and it stopped, another attempt at bypassing this obstacle. But so the answer is, it would be the second option that you outlined, but that second option is, although it's necessary, it's insufficient. It's insufficient because time and again he has to accept that he somehow hasn't succeeded in rendering what he wants to capture fully and completely. But I have to say, and it's not, despite all the disfigurations and the distortions, I mean, when I look at this, I mean, you still recognize Mick Jagger, don't you? It's the same with Michel Laris. I never had the pleasure of encountering Michel Laris in person, but if you see a photograph of Michel Laris and then you see Francis Bacon's distorted, disfigured painting, it's Michel Laris. So there's a huge paradox there, that the disfiguration never goes so far as falling into what Bacon probably would have called the trap of expressionism, where it's taken beyond the point of recognizability. So there's a sense of distortion at work, but at the same time, as a representation of Mick Jagger, it's still recognizable, right? But the question then is, how do you combine the two? Right? How do you combine this intimate reality, I mean, which we call the real of an experience that animates the figure that you want to capture on the canvas on the one hand, with on the other hand the recognizability that he also wants to maintain in order to avoid the trap of expressionism or abstraction. Right. So that would be my improvised answer to your terrific questions. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, Deborah, and thank you again to Dany. So we're a little behind. Let's have 20 minutes for coffee, and then we'll start again. The bathroom, just as a reminder, is out of here, turn right, about 50 meters down, turn left into a large cafe, and you'll find it in there. So if we could start again, please, at 12:20. If you'll just join me in thanking our speaker again.